The Russian side is not really convincing when I look at it, and you know, their track record so far in the war has been poor. So I have less and less confidence in what they say, because all the time their narrative is, yeah, it's all part of the plan. Yeah, but whose plan? Is it really Putin's plan? Or in fact, is it Zelensky's plan? Salut! Greetings from Bucharest in Romania, where I've relocated to since Russia's new invasion of Ukraine. And the question that I'm going to address today is Russia losing the war in Ukraine? And I don't mean in the long run. Addressed that in yesterday's video when I reacted to Johnny Harris's hypothesis that basically Russia will not be able to occupy Ukraine successfully after it takes it. But you know, will they even get that far? Because in the last week or so, I've noticed a shift in a lot of the media coverage that's pro-Western, starting to slowly say that maybe the Ukrainians are actually going to win this war. And I've also seen a shift in the pro-Russian narrative, which is instead of the initial demands that they're basically going to march into Kiev and replace the Zelensky regime, i.e. the democratically elected government of Ukraine, now they don't seem so gung-ho about that. No, we just wanted to take a little bit of the south and force basically a peace deal, get recognition for Crimea. So definitely the mood has changed. It is day 20 of Russia's new invasion of Ukraine. Probably you were like me at the beginning of this war, and you bought into the narrative that was basically from both sides, because I spend a lot of big parts of each day reading both pro-Russian and pro-Western / pro-Ukrainian media. And the narrative was that basically the Russian military is way too superior to the Ukrainian, and it'll be a quick and easy victory. And the real question is whether they can actually successfully occupy or install or control Ukraine afterwards, not really whether they're going to win militarily in the short run. But professor from my alma mater, Francis Fukuyama, famous guy, who I often haven't agreed with in the past, especially when I was a student there because it was time of the Iraq War, he posited that in fact Ukraine's going to win militarily, and he published an article that got circulated quite a lot, maybe about 2 or 3 days ago. And also the dean of my former faculty at SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, Johns Hopkins University, he also has gone in that vein, that direction in his analysis, that actually the Ukrainians are going to win. And you know, first glance, that seems unbelievable when you look at the force sizes, the size of each of their militaries and their sophistication. And you know, posited also with many of my friends, former clients, some have military experience, some have governmental experience, and most of them just in disbelief that's even possible. I mean, Russia has unlimited supplies and material and reserves. They're supposed to have close to a 1 million-man army, and they've sent 200,000 troops officially to Ukraine, more or less. So surely they can just call up their reserves. But it's a bit strange that Russia has put out this call for Middle Eastern mercenaries, and they're constantly seem to be pressurizing the Belarusians to come into the war, when if they have all these other troops and material, well, why don't you just send them if they're getting bogged down in Ukraine? Because it's day 20, and you know, I watched the Russian general this morning talk about how they are now in control of Kherson Oblast. Yippee, it's day 20, and if you were to believe all the analysts on both sides before the war, well, it was a question of day 3 or day 15 that the Russians were going to win. And they basically, at the moment, control one strategic town in the country, that is Kherson, that they've actually taken and they control. And that there's the water supply down to Crimea from Novokakhovka. But other than that, they don't actually control anywhere. And even Mariupol, that was the first city they started attacking on the first morning of the war, they still haven't taken it. And they haven't taken Kiev. I mean, there were tanks in Obolon the first day, which is a suburb in the north of Kiev. They still haven't taken the city, haven't taken Chernihiv, where I had an interview with Mike, an American guy who fled there a week ago. Still haven't taken Kharkiv, even though they've decimated the downtown, where I used to go with my clients, wrecked it, just vandalism, terrorism in effect, but they still haven't taken the city. And other cities like Sumy, it seems the same. So it started to make me think, well, if that's all they can take in 20 days, are they going to actually be able to take the country or large parts of it at all? Now, I'm not a military analyst. Let's say I went, have this background in international relations, but I've never worked in that field directly on military strategy since then. So definitely, I'm not claiming to be a doyen in that field, but I'm going to review this article by a doyen, Francis Fukuyama and Elia Cohen, also similar input. So how I judge things is I look at what both sides have been basically saying for the last few months. Pro-Russian side, we would never invade Ukraine. Obviously, they already invaded in 2014, but yeah, well, they were completely wrong because Putin did decide to invade, or they were just lying and they knew all the time. And that's the reason not to really trust them very much. And then pro-Western side and US intelligence was saying basically they're going to invade, they're going to invade, they're going to invade. A lot of people on YouTube, especially those useful idiots who since delete a lot of their videos because they're too embarrassing, I guess, saying that, yeah, only an idiot basically will think that Russia is going to invade with 200,000 troops in Ukraine. And that's exactly what they did. So they don't have a good track record. And since the war has begun, both sides have changed their narrative. The pro-Western side has become more optimistic, and the pro-Russian side just seems to keep changing their narrative to suit and try to rationalize the lack of progress on the ground. I look back at some of the videos from the first few days, and there are claims that they had already taken Ukraine and ushering in a new era on day 2 or 3. And now here we are in day 20 of the war. And they still don't control Kiev or anything more than Kherson and parts of the south of Ukraine. So let me just take this article from Francis Fukuyama and address the points in it. All right, let me read the first point in his very short article. I'll link down below in the description to this video. Russia is heading for an outright defeat in Ukraine. Russian planning was incompetent based on a flawed assumption that Ukrainians were favorable to Russia and that their military would collapse immediately following an invasion. Russian soldiers were evidently carrying dress uniforms for their victory parade in Kiev rather than extra ammo and rations. Putin at this point has committed the bulk of his entire military to the operation. There are no vast reserves of forces he can call up to add to the battle. Russian troops are stuck outside various Ukrainian cities where they face huge supply problems and constant Ukrainian attacks. Now there's a good bit in that, there's a few sentences. Yeah, as I just alluded to, the fact that they're calling up these Syrian mercenaries and hoping for Belarusian troops to come doesn't suggest that they got a lot of reserves. So that part seems plausible. And definitely you saw in the beginning, the triumphalism that I saw anyways, a lot of the pro-Russian media, that they were basically going to win quickly. Hubris, and that hasn't, we're day 20, so they are definitely stuck outside the cities. So, and that also fits in with what the Russian propaganda is saying at home. It's not a war officially, it's some sort of military intervention. So it makes it sound like it's going to be short and quick. And I don't know what your definition of quick is, but 20 days of a war and you seem very far from your original strategic objectives. It suggests that, yeah, it's going to take longer than a month minimum. And is that short or long for military intervention? Well, you just have to look at things historically. And of course, Russia's suffering from the economic sanctions, which I guess they've factored into their calculations when they started it. But yeah, you don't want that to keep going because there's just going to be more of those kind of sanctions going forward, and you always risk something happening domestically in Russia. Like people actually get upset about their soldiers getting killed in a war that they don't really understand why they're there probably at the end of the day if the region starts to fall apart. So that, I mean, he says he's heading for an outright defeat. That's a big claim, and he does say he's taking his neck out. I think that also, there's a bit of an assumption there that Ukraine won't sue for peace or agree to some sort of peace settlement in the meantime before it comes to that defeat. And, I reacted in my last live stream to what I call, the kind of appeaseniks who just say Ukraine can't win, they should just agree to all Russia's terms so people don't get killed. No more people get killed, either Ukrainians or Russians. But, yeah, it seems like things are going very, very slowly and they're having more and more supply issues. And if they don't have more reserves to call up, then maybe if Ukraine doesn't agree to peace terms with them, they might actually lose. That's definitely a possibility. So let me read the next point. The collapse of their position could be sudden and catastrophic rather than happening slowly through a war of attrition. The army in the field will reach a point where it can neither be supplied or withdrawn, and morale will vaporize. This is at least true in the north. The Russians are doing better in the south, but these positions will be hard to maintain if the north collapses. Yeah, well, definitely one thing that I've seen is there's a lot of looting and plunder by the Russian forces. They don't seem to have the supplies necessary, or maybe they have the supplies, but they decide to go steal stuff off the locals. And I've seen that a lot of videos that have come out of Ukraine in the occupied parts, the newly occupied parts of the country, like raiding shops, showing up at people's houses, trying to loot everything, stealing chicken, stuff that looks pretty ridiculous and pathetic for a so-called professional army that's aiming to occupy the country with friendly locals afterwards to help them. Well, that's definitely not a great PR exercise. I think most of that damage has been done by Putin's declaration of war speech 2 days before, where he basically denied that Ukrainians have a right to be independent of whatever he wants. So, and on top of that, I've spoken to people who are there still in Ukraine, and they tell me exactly that's what happens. That they show up and they basically commandeer stuff off the locals, they raid all the supplies, because apparently they don't have them themselves. They were not planning apparently to be having a war for 20 days, and they've been plundering and looting at least from a few days into the war. Maybe I started seeing reports around day 5 or 6. It's already 2 weeks. And eventually going to run out of things to loot if there are not more supplies coming in. So that's definitely seems very valid from what I've seen on both social media and people I've talked to who are actually there on the ground. Whether they would be sudden and catastrophic as opposed to attrition, I'm not so sure. I guess you would have to see a large-scale surrender of Russian troops. So there are also reports, but okay, this is a war, there's propaganda for both sides. I understand that fog of war, what's really going on is pretty hard to see. But there's definitely reports that the Russian soldiers are under threat of being shot if they try to desert or retreat. And that's pretty worrying, because at a certain point, if that's true, they may actually just collapse, even start fighting amongst each other. But anyways, that's not entirely clear to me at the moment if there will be a complete collapse. But definitely in the north, they are going slower than the south. The south, they do control Kherson and that oblast and parts of Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblast, and they got Mariupol apparently surrounded. I saw some drone footage of just the carnage there. It's really tragic. One of the pretexts for this war on the Russian side is they were going to save the Russian speakers of Ukraine, there was a genocide against people in Donbass. Well, now they're just absolutely obliterating and razing the culture and the existence of the Russian speakers, the cities that they're leveling. And I saw there's one city just in Donbass that they took, and I watched a video from a Russian soldier where they're just shooting up stuff, like apartment blocks, and there doesn't seem to be anyone firing back at them. It's just like for fun. They've just gone around destroying this place. They just seem to be just wrecking stuff for no reason, for no military gain. So yeah, not very professional looking in general to be up to that on day 20 of an invasion. Next point from Fukuyama. There is no diplomatic solution. Actually, just before I say that, Francis Fukuyama did write a famous book called The End of History and the Last Man. It's written after the end of the Cold War. It was kind of a triumphal treatise about how basically liberal democracy and capitalism had won, and that was kind of the search for the optimal system or the best system. And that hasn't entirely worked out, but it's a famous book, so you should definitely read it to critique it at least. So, third point he makes, there is no diplomatic solution to the war possible prior to this happening. Yeah, before there's an actual collapse. I think Putin looks very emotional for the last year. I've seen that in my early videos before the war, and that was very worrying, because an emotional person is probably not going to make rational decisions and take big gambles. And he seems very stubborn. His ego is attached to this war. It's his war. So is he going to compromise before it's inevitable? And is he getting real-time intelligence from the field? Are the people around him actually telling him how things are going in reality, or are they just feeding him what he wants to hear? So that's definitely seems, looking at the kind of leader that Russia has, very possible. Next point, there is no conceivable compromise that will be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine given the losses they have at this point. Yeah, that's very dangerous. I alluded to that just a minute or two ago, that unless they find a compromise, this war could go very extreme, and Russia can call in these non-conventional weapons, which is very worrying about the number of people that they can kill civilians. They've already killed I mean, there's so many dead civilians and dead Russian soldiers as well as Ukrainians. I mean, it's terrible, the whole thing. And obviously, this attempt to, well, it seems to obliterate Russian-speaking culture in Ukraine, and the vestige of it is like horrible. So what would be acceptable both sides? If you have a very stubborn leader who wants absolute victory, that's going to be very difficult. But we have seen changes in the Russian position, so maybe, yeah, there is room for compromise. Would the Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainian leadership, be willing to give Russia something, give them an off-ramp? That's tricky, because would they survive politically afterwards if they give Putin a way to claim that he won, and then he stays in power in Russia? What's he going to do if he stays in power in Russia and he's able to claim a victory and the Russian people believe that they won? Well, he may just rearm, learn his mistakes from this invasion, and come back and attack Ukraine again. So it's kind of a tricky situation whether Ukrainians, if it is a case that Russia is not looking like they're going to win militarily quickly, should they make a compromise to save people's lives in the short run? Because yeah, that might come home to haunt them in 6 months or 6 years. So not easy to see that. I think in the last few days with these negotiations, there seems to be more positive vibe coming out of it. So maybe he's wrong about that. Maybe we will see a solution before the Russian army collapses or the Ukrainian army collapses. Next point, the United Nations Security Council has proven once again to be useless. The only helpful thing was the General Assembly vote, which helps identify the world's bad and provocating actors. Yeah, basically the UN is not going to be able to do anything because Russia has the veto on the Security Council and it's a belligerent. So that just goes without saying. Next point, the Biden administration's decisions not to declare a new fly zone or help transfer Polish MiGs were both good ones. They've kept their heads during a very emotional time. It is much better to have the Ukrainians defeat the Russians on their own, depriving Moscow of the excuse that NATO attacked them, as well as avoiding all the obvious escalatory possibilities. The Polish MiGs in particular would not add much to Ukrainian capabilities. Much more important is a continuing supply of Javelin, Stingers, TB2s, medical supplies, comms equipment, and intel sharing. I assume that Ukrainian forces are already being vectored by NATO intelligence operating from outside Ukraine. So, yeah, I kind of agree about the no-fly zone because, you know, the Russians don't seem to have air dominance. Like, they don't seem to have complete control of the skies to be able to back up their land forces. And everybody seemed to say, at least at the beginning for both sides, that was going to happen the first few hours. And now we're at day 20 and they still don't have it. So a no-fly zone might actually compromise also the Ukrainians, because they were using these Turkish-supplied drones quite effectively, it seems, at least in the videos that I see on pro-Ukrainian media, and blowing up stuff all the time with them. So yeah, maybe the no-fly zone, he's right. The Polish MiGs, when the Ukrainians are also asking for those, so that would help them in the air and also allow them to attack, I guess, Russian ground troops. Would it lead to escalation if they gave them those? I don't really see why that's a red line, because obviously the NATO countries are already helping the Ukrainians. They're supplying them with all these other equipment. So, you know, it's an aircraft as opposed to having a rocket to shoot at a tank. Seems a little bit of an arbitrary red line to me. I'm not sure it's actually going to lead to any escalation. They've said that basically if Russia were to use chemical or biological weapons or nuclear weapons, that this would be a red line, they would get a response. So they seem to be willing to escalate if that happens. So this thing about fighter jets just seems rather odd and arbitrary. But anyways, yeah, probably no-fly zone is a little bit of a red herring for the Ukrainians in reality. The cost that Ukraine is paying is enormous, of course. But the greatest damage is being done by rockets and artillery, which neither MiGs nor an Fly Zone can do much about. The only thing that will stop the slaughter is defeat of the Russian army in the ground. Yeah, I kind of didn't read his full point, I think, when I started adding that. Yeah, a lot of the Russian propaganda is that they're fighting NATO, so as much as they can limit that actually being the case, then I guess the better. But it's, you know, Russian propaganda war at home, at least, seems pretty comprehensive. The best guesstimates are that 70% of the Russian population support the war. So, yeah, I think they just believe, it appears that most Russians believe they really are fighting NATO when they're in principle fighting Ukrainians, who they keep calling the brother nation. And they're killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians in their droves. And they don't seem to get that. So unfortunately, I'm not so sure that really makes a difference. Next point, Putin will not survive defeat of his army. He gets support because he's perceived to be a strong man. What does he have to offer once he demonstrates incompetence and is stripped of his coercive power? definitely that seems to be the case, because most people I talk to who are pro-Putin, whether they're overtly or covertly pro-Putin, that's the main reason. They think the guy's a genius chess master, strongman, tough, real man, and that's all predicated on the fact that he could achieve things that he sets out as his goals. So obviously if he fails and it's his war, definitely that's going to undermine him. The invasion, next point, the invasion has already done huge damage to populists all over the world. I'll just skip that because it's kind of a general political point that's not really to do with Ukraine. And then they talk about China and Taiwan. He talks about, but I know absolutely nothing about that, so there's no value in me commenting. Next point, Turkish drones will become bestsellers. Definitely looks like they were apparently used to great effect in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azeri and Armenian forces. So definitely here, they've got a good advertisement for themselves. Actually, interesting, at the beginning of the war, I was listening to an American general who said that this war would be good advertisement for Russian weapon sales, is to be able to demonstrate how effective they are. Not so sure. The Russians are going to be selling more weapons as a result of this war. It doesn't really look like they've so far been that impressive. So next point, a Russian defeat will make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. The spirit of 1989 will live on, thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians. Well, that's definitely an optimistic point to end his article on. A new birth for freedom. Yes, I think liberal democracy has definitely been under pressure in the West in the last decade or so. And yeah, a victory, a military victory, if that were to be the case, by Ukraine, a liberal democracy, although a very dysfunctional liberal democracy, more a struggle for liberal democracy as opposed to the alternative system, which is obviously Putin's brand of authoritarianism in Russia. Definitely Ukrainians winning that war would give liberal democracy a boost. I think that's pretty clear, but we have to see if that happens. A new birth of freedom similar to 1989. That's definitely a big optimistic claim that, you know, we'll get this, I guess, democratic boost around the world. But what I have seen is in the EU, I've never seen this amount of unity on almost any topic. You had major political figures who are lauding Putin, wanted to be photographed with him, hoping that being photographed with him would even help their re-election chances or their election chances. I'm thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's up for re-election next month. And now he has to make a pivot, and I'm considering going to Hungary in the next week. So I'll actually be there to be able to report on the ground a little bit. Not that I intend to focus on Hungarian politics, but it will be interesting because apparently now he's organizing, his party organizing anti-Russian invasion demonstration, at least anti-war demonstrations. Was definitely a big change from when before the war he was only too keen to be photographed with him, and Marine Le Pen, who's running against Emmanuel Macron in the French elections around the same time. And Macron is now an overwhelming favorite to win. I saw, you know, The Economist magazine claimed it was 95% certain because she actually had put on her election pamphlets a photo with Putin. Additionally, she's been a big admirer of him in the past. So that's kind of a toxic brand to be associated with. Actually, Russia in general has become a toxic brand. And also one of the other candidates is Zemmour in the French elections, also been praising Putin recently, and they've got to backtrack because, yeah, it's a toxic brand in terms of getting elected in their case. So, yeah, interesting to see all that happen and how, you know, they were riding on a crest of popularity about his, I guess, his strong man or his competence, and now that we have this war in Ukraine, this new invasion, killed Russia's brand. So, in general, looking at, you know, his points, not sure I'm completely convinced by them, but every day that goes on, every day I look at the pro-Russian media, and the pro-Russian media, by the way, I mean, they have a lot of useful idiots who repeat their propaganda. None of it's new. Most stuff, when people send me videos from pro-Russian YouTubers in English, because I've read all their points on the guys I follow on Twitter or whatever who are from the Russian side. It's just the same stuff, and you can read it also in English, not just in Russian. They rarely have any videos to back up their claims, so you don't see that much, and that could be just, and I see it, by the way, on the Ukrainian side, a lot of videos backing up their claims, so it could be just that Ukrainians are doing better propaganda. They actually film a lot more of their gains on the battlefield or when they capture soldiers or when they destroy materiel, because the Russian side is not really convincing when I look at it, and you know, their track record so far in the war has been poor. So I have less and less confidence in what they say, because all the time their narrative is, yeah, it's all part of the plan. Yeah, but whose plan? Is it really Putin's plan? Or in fact, is it Zelensky's plan? Anyways, time is going to tell. It looks more and more to me like actually Ukraine is going to win quicker than I originally thought. I thought it'd be a very long war, partisan war going on over maybe a long number of years. I left Ukraine not really thinking I was going to be able to go back for a long time. Maybe that's the case. It could be a Ukrainian military victory, it could also be a Russian military victory, or there could be a compromise in between, but it is looking increasingly towards Ukrainian victory militarily, or a compromise been made in the meantime. So, yeah, Slava Ukraina, Rom Slava, and see you in the next video from Bucharest. I'm still here, I'm actually in a park, and there's an EU flag over there, because this park has, it's Herăstrău. It has all these statues with these heads that maybe you saw earlier when I was walking around, for the founders of the European Union. And o seară bună, do побачення, до свидания, ciao ciao.
SAR Experience.